Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for waiting. I hope you all had a chance to get some rest during the break. It's my pleasure now to actually begin our closing session for what I believe has been an incredibly successful conference. So I see some new faces and some individuals that'll be giving some remarks during our closing session. That includes the governor of the Central Bank of Armenia, Martin Galstyan, as well as some of our esteemed senior advisors who've been working with us for quite some time. That includes Bob Ford, Larry Schembri, and Hamid Faruqee. So welcome everyone to our closing session. And really what I wanted to focus on in the closing session is rather than necessarily being backward looking, we really want to look ahead to the future. And so this is going to be kind of a forward-looking closing session where we reflect a little bit on what it is that we've accomplished and what we've learned, but really focusing on kind of the task at hand for the remainder of the year and as we look ahead to our upcoming 2 workshops in July and October. So I want to start by just reflecting on the workshop just a little bit. I want to thank all of you for the very lively discussions. I think we'd all agree that while we had some fantastic presentations, I think they were made all the better by the contributions from everyone in the audience, including those of us here at the Central Bank of Armenia joining in person, as well as our many guests from all around the world, kind of navigating the difficult time zones and all that. So I appreciate everyone's close involvement in that. I think, some kind of high level takeaways to kind of build off of what Edgar presented this morning in terms of our kind of takeaways from the seminar. I think I would agree that a lot of the presentations, of course, are very fantastic. They were, a lot of them were very academically or technically oriented in nature, but I think that's only true on a surface level. And what we found was that this research has truly covered a lot of topics that are incredibly relevant for us from a policymaking perspective. And so I think the policy relevance of these research topics was something that was very, very important. So looking ahead, I think one of the kind of key takeaways that I had in terms of the content of what was covered, certainly we talked a lot about financial vulnerabilities, and that's something that, of course, is incredibly relevant for us. We've been closely following that in our work at the Global Forecasting School, the Central Bank of Armenia. And of course, kind of everyone everywhere is also closely following that. So here I think what we took away from the audience was the emphasis of looking at both the asset and the liability side when we're thinking about financial vulnerabilities. And certainly I think we had presentations that each touched upon those 2 sides. And I think when we look at them in synthesis, we get a much fuller picture and something that better allows us to think about the financial vulnerabilities that we're facing. Some of the other ideas, of course, Michael Kiley did a fantastic presentation that really pushed everyone, I think, to think more holistically about what recession indicators might be. And so simply his approach really was a 3-pronged approach that called for looking at kind of financial indicators. Of course, everyone talks about the yield curve, but not thinking about them just in isolation, also looking at some leading indicators. He used kind of an OECD composite index that contained a lot of information, as well as kind of looking at the state of the business cycle. And so looking at these 3 ideas in synthesis, and also kind of thinking about when they might be relevant together in isolation and across what time horizon. So I think it's a fantastic kind of framework for us to be thinking about, the recessionary risks and things like that, particularly in these times. And lastly, I think some of the best keynote presentations that we received, I think Michelle and Junior both did a fantastic job talking about how much we can push our modeling software to allow us to think more critically about these issues and to produce better output. And I think we just heard from Junior just a few minutes ago, of course, on applications for RISE. And I think we all really enjoyed that. And also Michelle's presentation really highlighted the value of open source software. So really Dinar Julia allowing us to kind of push the frontiers of transparency without necessarily sacrificing anything in terms of our technical capabilities. So that, of course, is an important component of our kind of analytical framework, is trying to push everything to open source to allow, again, for maximum transparency as a central bank, and allowing, essentially an infinite audience to replicate or critique our analysis. So that, I think, are my major takeaways of what we learned. And that's kind of my backward looking component of of the seminar. But what I'd really like to shift gears to is talking a little bit about our FPAS Mark II framework. And of course, you heard in our panel discussion today from members of our team a lot of kind of different viewpoints in terms of, some of the key frequently asked questions related to FPAS Mark II. What is it that people are kind of most interested in understanding, areas that, we drilled into in a lot more detail. But of course, what I want to focus on simply is kind of mapping out to you guys what it is that we've kind of accomplished so far this year, and in particular, where we're headed in terms of our next steps. So we've been, of course, working very, very hard in terms of developing this new policymaking framework. I think you heard during the panel about the impetus for why we decided to develop this framework, and I think the governor will share a few thoughts as well in terms of where that imperative came from. But we've, of course, been working both here at the Central Bank of Armenia and, of course, as part of our kind of signature dynamic learning environment, engaging globally with some thought leaders who were privileged to have joining us today at the seminar. We've been working in a number of directions. So that includes, first and foremost, really codifying our price stability framework and explaining clearly what it is that we mean by price stability, and developing, of course, a proper framework within our policymaking framework to think about price stability. One of the key components of that we've been working on is looking at developing alternative measures of underlying inflation. And this, of course, is a topic that's been really important for us. I think many people in the discipline over the past couple of years or so have also been, highlighting the importance of alternative measures. And so we're certainly thinking about those as well. Something that we've developed that's largely complete and we're continuing to refine is a measure for non-traded sticky price inflation. So that's kind of taking some of the ideas that the Atlanta Fed inspired us with their sticky price inflation and thinking about the non-traded component of that, which we think does a really good job of eliminating a lot of the noise, particularly related to external shocks that can muddy some of the data. So we're obviously really thinking about that noise to signal ratio and what might be valuable there in terms of our measures of inflation. Of course, kind of emphasizing that we think about these ideas as economists, right, rather than as statisticians. So we're thinking about their applications, and we're not simply looking at them as as numbers that necessarily tell us what to do, but are part of a broader narrative and story about how we're thinking about the economy. Some of the other things which will be touched upon in the closing remarks by Larry Schembri is developing an advanced communications and transparency framework. Of course, we've been thinking about and talked a little bit during the panel about the importance of communications under FPAS Mark II. I think the view of our team certainly is that communications becomes easier during FPAS Mark II, not more difficult. But there clearly is a kind of imperative on us to make sure that we're effectively communicating this to the public and to the key stakeholders in a clear and effective way. So we've made quite a bit of progress on that communication framework, developed a number of vehicles to help us have kind of a multi-layered approach to communications. And Larry will talk about that a little bit and some of the ways we're going to be pushing that forward with a course after our July workshop this summer. Some of the other kind of advancements that we've made include a lot of progress on our analytical framework. So we speak, of course, of the folly of local approximations. And so we emphasize the need for kind of a full analytical suite of models that includes both a nonlinear core production model, as well as a number of kind of linear satellite models that help us kind of round out that analytical framework. And of course, lastly, one of the things that we have been actively engaged in is exploring a number of hot topics in economics. So those of you that join our weekly seminars certainly can see how we kind of tackle these week in, week out. And on the Central Bank of Armenia's website, you can find a number of working papers that explore some of these topics. You also heard from my colleague Avagyan talking about an analytical framework for thinking about unconventional policies in Armenia as just one example. But of course, there's been quite a number of these hot topics that we continue to explore. In terms of some projects that are currently underway, so I think all the things that I mentioned we're continuing to refine, so they're not, everything is always a work in progress. It's kind of like my life's philosophy. But some other projects that are currently underway is a project that looks at data management and really kind of consolidating a lot of the data that we have, and with the eye of, not just allowing us internally to access and use that data more efficiently, but also allowing us to share that data publicly and allow kind of a further degree of transparency in our communications as something that's kind of updated on a daily basis. And something I'd highlight there is we take a very holistic approach to everything that we do here in our FPAS Mark II development. So this has really allowed us to work and collaborate really, really well with folks in the IT department, statistics department, and so on, and has allowed us to really move forward at lightning speeds. I think when people think central banks, they think bureaucracies, and I think we're showing that it's possible to get a lot of these things done when everyone is kind of committed to the same broader vision of being super efficient, being super productive, and ultimately having really good output done in a quick amount of time. So I'm really pleased with the progress there. We're also working quite a bit on our nowcasting for certain variables, in particular GDP. So that's of course another thing, and we also take some inspiration there from the Atlanta Fed and their GDP Now, but of course it's simply an idea, and we're applying it in a somewhat different way. So the idea is that a number of these projects that I identified would be complete largely by the middle of the year. So come our July workshop, I think we'll be able to share quite a bit of progress on these fronts. And then the second half of the year, which I'm most excited about, is actually putting a lot of this into practice in terms of what I kind of refer to as beta testing these ideas. So concurrent with our traditional projection rounds, right, where we do everything kind of the FPAS Mark I way, we can currently do a shadow projection where we test out kind of a full simulation of the 28-day policymaking cycle. And so that allows us to really figure out what any pressure points are beyond what we've already identified and kind of smooth those out before we fully launch the framework. We also kind of want to test out our communications framework in that time frame as well. So, drafting out full MPRs during our shadow projection and testing out some of the other kind of communications vehicles during that time frame, just to again see how everything works. So we're very much kind of in an iterative mindset where we're hoping to kind of try things out, get feedback from all the stakeholders that are involved, and continue to refine these processes. Some of the other things that I think we touched upon a little bit during our panel, but is really the importance of highlighting communications in terms of training people on both the new framework as well as just broader kind of literacy questions. So this will allow us to, again, kind of ensure maximum smoothness with the rollout of the new framework to make our jobs easier down the road and ensure that we don't have any kind of hiccups there. So we're going to be closely involved with members from the media, academia, and of course, financial markets and commercial banks to, one, kind of explain fundamentally what the new framework is about, how it's different from the old framework, as well as to kind of get them used to our new communications vehicles and to overall try to improve their literacy, where we kind of equip them with the tools and the kind of resources necessary for them to start doing a little bit more thinking than perhaps what people are traditionally used to doing. And so taking on some more of the mantle there in terms of trying to become thought leaders, trying to do some sort of risk management on their own. So kind of diversifying the information field, we think. I think as some of the papers presented during the workshop shown, I think are really important things. And the last thing that we're going to be focusing on is, of course, doing some onboarding for our board members. I think we've really highlighted the importance of kind of having board members that are fully kind of have full command of the policymaking cycle, of all the kind of nuances of monetary policy. And so not just kind of on that technical component, but of course, understanding the ins and outs of the new framework, again, to make sure that our board members on an individual and collective level are able to contribute in a very deep way to the process. And that, of course, is a major highlight of FPAS Mark II, is having the board members take on a greater degree of individual accountability. And it's something that we're very proud of, but of course requires a high degree of investment from the staff. So it's something we certainly don't shy away from. So with that kind of general roadmap in mind, I want to talk a little bit about the July workshop, because I think for many of you, this format that we've been exploring in this workshop might have been a little bit unfamiliar, in the sense that the central bank macro modeling workshops for the past 25 years have been done on an annual basis and have been very kind of large in scope. We typically see about 60 to 100 kind of submitted papers that are presented during the workshops. They're done during concurrent sessions, so people kind of go into different rooms and hear different papers, but it's a lot more kind of we call it kind of like a happy chaos kind of approach to doing a conference. I think it's what most people are used to when they see conferences. And this approach here in our quarterly workshops, I think we intend as a more intimate affair to allow us to actually focus that full hour and a half on delving deeply into research, having our keynote speakers really speak their minds, and of course have that lively discussion, which I think was the highlight of this conference for me. So in our July workshop, that is our annual flagship workshop. So that will continue to be in the traditional kind of large scale format that we all are used to. So we're going to be having, again, a large number of papers presented. And if you're interested in submitting your research to present at the workshop, I'd encourage you to do so if you haven't done so already. The formal submission deadline is May 1st, and you can find links for submitting your research on the betterpolicyproject.org. Of course, the other thing that I'm most excited about and that our speakers will be touching upon in a little bit is the courses that we're going to be teaching after the workshop. So we think of the workshop, again, as part of this broader dynamic learning environment. So it doesn't stop once these 3 days are over. Rather, the weeks following the workshop, we're going to have a number of courses by some very esteemed scholars with quite a bit of experience, both on the technical side and I'd say, on some of the more kind of providing a lot of wisdom from their experience. So this includes Michelle Juilliard, who you heard from at this seminar, teaching a course on Diner Julia applications. Larry Schembri, who's going to talk a little bit about this in more detail, but looking at advanced communications for monetary policy with a particular eye towards helping kind of board members and their advisors and other members of communication staff really refine their communication practices to align with international best standards, particularly given the additional imperatives that FS Mark II provides. So we're also going to hear from Junior, who's going to teach a course on RISE applications. Again, another brilliant mind. So those of you who are kind of interested in that, definitely sign up for that course, as well as Hamid Faruqee, who's on the line right now. And we'll talk a little bit about his course on DSG economics and how we can kind of, in a more healthy way, I think, relate to DSG economics and DSG models. We're also going to have a course on fiscal policy taught by Werner Roger, who's probably one of the best in the world to have looked at these topics. And lastly, we're going to have an advanced macro seminar taught by Ioannis Halikias, who has a kind of a wealth of experience formerly at the IMF. So we have quite a bit planned, and I think July is going to give us an opportunity to both look at, again, all this submitted research, provide you all with updates on our framework, but also give everyone a platform to learn from these very esteemed scholars after the workshop. So that's essentially all that I had in mind for my closing remarks, but I'm going to pass it on now to the other kind of people that we've lined up for our quarterly or for our closing session, excuse me. And the idea really is now Larry is going to kind of walk us through some of these issues related to advanced communications for monetary policy and maybe talk a little bit about what he's planning on teaching in July, just enough to get you interested and not give you too much information, of course. And then Hamid Faruqee will take over after that, talking about DSG economics. And we'll then have Bob Ford chime in with some opportunities and challenges for monetary policy in 2023 and beyond. And lastly, the kind of keynote conclusion will be provided by the governor of the Central Bank of Armenia, reflecting a little bit on FPAS Mark II and looking ahead to what remains to be done. So thank you so much again, everyone, for participating in this truly exceptional conference. And I look forward to seeing you all again in July. Larry, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks, Vahe. That was a great introduction. I mean, I appreciate the lead into the course. I think you touched on the fact that the improvements that we've seen over time in terms of macroeconomic modeling, which was, some of these improvements and advances were highlighted by this workshop. That's made monetary policy communications much easier, and I agree entirely. Having an analytical framework supporting communications is a critical thing. We're all familiar with, Doug Laxton's career, and it spans many generations of macroeconomic modeling. And I'm delighted that he's taken it upon himself, and with the assistance of the Global Forecasting School team, to continue this workshop. I think it's extremely valuable in terms of continuing to evolve macroeconomic modeling for use of central banks in the formulation of monetary policy. At the same time, we've seen macroeconomic modeling evolve, coping with new developments in technology, new challenges, new opportunities. We've seen monetary policy communications also evolve. You look back 50 years and central banks and how they conducted monetary policy was very different than now. I mean, it was very secretive. It was very opaque. It seemed to reflect the mantra of the time that, former Bank of England Governor Montague Norman had his own personal motto, which was never explain, never excuse. And that seemed to be the mindset of the time. And things have changed a lot since then. We central bankers go out of their way to explain their decisions, provide a lot of communications, and that communications has evolved over time, reflecting the changing environment we're dealing with. Now, and we know the part of the rationale for the increased transparency is a lot of academic research has shown quite convincingly that increased transparency of monetary policy renders it more effective. It makes the transmission of monetary policy stronger if people understand what the objectives are, how the central bank is actually conducting monetary policy, what tools it's using. And so if people understand those aspects of the conduct of monetary policy, it's going to be transmitted more easily through financial markets. So that's an important aspect. And the other aspect, which Mike Woodford has stressed, is the impact on expectations. That transparency really can influence expectations, and if we can influence expectations in such a way that it towards anchoring the inflation target, so much the better. That's a lot of the work done through communications. And so what this course will do is really look at some of the challenges and opportunities communications is facing, and it's the similar challenges and opportunities that macro modeling has also experienced over the last couple of decades and is facing now. And really, in terms of implementing FPAS Mark II, which is focused on nonlinearities and uncertainty, that means to really embrace those notions, one has to adapt the communications as well. Also, as we change the structure for governing monetary policy, Evie Trong was talking about how the Reserve Bank of New Zealand has gone from a sole decision maker being the governor to a committee consisting of internal and external members, and that's typical of other central banks and typical of the Central Bank of Armenia as well. And the question is, how do those people work together to deliberate and come to a policy decision? How much transparency should there be about those deliberations, and how should they communicate the decision? Should they speak as one voice? Should they express their own views to give a sense of the uncertainty around the monetary policy decision? So how monetary policy is governed is really an important aspect that determines how it's communicated. And so that's an issue that we definitely want to look at. And also the aspect of technological change. We now have innovations that allow us to reach different audiences with our communications, whether it's layered approaches to a monetary policy report, the use of social media, the use of online surveys and questionnaires as an outreach mechanism. So the technology has really created an opportunity for new forms of communications that we want to take on board. And clearly, the advent of a lower global, real equilibrium real interest rate, the lower R star, as we want to call it, means that we're going to have to use a broader set of tools when we're at the effective lower bound. And so communicating those tools, including explicit forward guidance, unconventional large asset purchases, that's going to require more communications to explain the implementation and the effectiveness of those tools. So that, the course that we're envisioning will speak to these challenges and opportunities, and it will be conducted in the spirit of the dynamic learning environment that is part and parcel of the Global Forecasting School. So that means interactive lectures, videos, and hands-on learning. And really what we want to, in terms of hands-on learning, we want to examine best practices of monetary policy transparency. We want to look at the structure of the Monetary Policy Committee and how they communicate. Reserve Bank of New Zealand, as Evie Trong mentioned today, has a charter that talks about how the committee should work, and also a code of conduct for committee members in terms of their communications. And I think that's something we want to take a closer look at and see whether it's applicable to other central banks as well. And as I mentioned, there are new forms of communication and outreach that we want to look at, not only in terms of just communicating monetary policy decisions, but addressing some of the issues in terms of literacy that Vahe mentioned, that we need to get the audience up to speed. And so we need to reach out to them and help them understand how we're conducting monetary policy. The use of social media that I mentioned already. And then in terms of media training, how do board members respond to questions from the media with this new framework? And so as part of this new framework, there are going to be multiple scenarios, and I think that's a communications challenge that we need to really think about. And so that's going to be part of what we try to take on board in this course. Plus, there's going to, we'd hope to have writing workshops that look at how best to write press releases, NPRs, the member submissions to the deliberations. Those things are all going to be critical elements of the transparency, and they're going to require some onboarding of members, as Vahe mentioned. So I'll stop there and have, if there are any questions, happy to take those. Thank you.
Larry, I think everyone's saving their questions for the course in July. So great. Thanks so much, Larry. It's always a pleasure to hear your perspective. Yeah, and thanks for all your contributions. We certainly couldn't have done it without you. So next up, I want to pass the mic to Hamid Faruqee. So Hamid, go ahead, please. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to join in on your conference. Happy to be here for this closing session. It's good to see you, colleagues of the central bank, and also some old friends like Larry and Bob. So I'm very excited to be part of a new online course on Introduction to DSGE Economics. This is in collaboration with colleagues from the central bank, of course, the Global Forecasting School, and the Better Policy Project. As you indicated here, we hope for a rollout in July at the time of the workshop. The course would work within the dynamic learning environment that I think many of you are familiar with. And so really, I'm excited to be part of a broader team as part of that. In terms of the broad aims of this course, it's really to build a comprehensive understanding of best-in-class DSGE and OLG models. Vahe, in your opening remarks, you talked about the importance of having a suite of models. I think this kind of course will kind of go through some of those key workhorse models that we've used at places like the IMF, with an eye towards practical applications for policy analysis, and something that Larry touched on, the importance of hands-on learning, hands-on training, and in the case of this course, having that opportunity for students to work in the open source code of Dynair Julia. Before I talk about the course itself, let me just say a few words about the dynamic learning environment, which I think many of you are familiar with. I'm actually new to it, so I think I want to go through this myself just to share my understanding. We're going to move away from kind of the traditional lecture format, with say myself or someone else providing lecture material, and really going to a non-hierarchical structure It'll really be team-based where we try to leverage a diversity of skills among the different people involved, including the students, and really have a kind of collaborative learning experience. So just in terms of the four pillars under the DLE approach, you have this commitment to excellence, really a kind of shared drive or purpose that we work with. The non-hierarchical approach where you can facilitate peer-to-peer learning, a lot of interactions between the different participants, and leveraging that diversity of skills that different people bring to the table. As part of that, feedback as a habit is an important part of the learning process. And the last thing I'll mention there when we talk about global engagement is that, as part of this collaborative learning experience, we want to take this even further. And the idea with working with Dynair Julia as an open source kind of coding framework, having a collaborative approach. I think this kind of course sets a platform, if you like, for future engagement, future collaboration, and model development in this particular case. And really being part of this DLE culture. So I'll be joined by Angela from the Global Forecasting School, who's the lead in GFS training. Haikaz from the Central Bank, who's one of our model experts and has led a lot of development work on the modeling side of the Central Bank. And then in each day in the course, we'll also have a new person to lead that day's topic. And in terms of thinking about a roadmap for the course, as kind of listed here, we really plan to cover, all the key macro frameworks, workhorse models that we've used at the fund and other places over the course of 5 days, starting with the familiar RBC, real business cycle models, going to dynamic stochastic general equilibrium DSGE models, both in a closed economy and open economy setting, and then ending up with OLG models after that. But one thing I really want to emphasize to the participants there is that I see this as more than just a modeling course. We plan to obviously learn about the ins and outs of these models and how we've used them, and but also to discuss their relative strengths and weaknesses, what the limits are with the different approaches. And as part of that, one of the emphasis that I have is to build kind of our critical thinking and judgment about how we use these tools and how best to leverage them depending on the economic question or the policy analysis or assessment that we want to focus on. So really, as the title of the course suggests, it's not just a modeling course. We intentionally put that word of DSGE economics. And hopefully what I'd like to bring to the course is maybe perhaps a unique perspective from a policy practitioner standpoint. From the experience that I've had, Doug has had, in terms of how we use the various macro models in the context of fund surveillance and broader policy issues. So the course will, of course, start with the RBC framework. As all of you know, this was kind of the first wave of dynamic general equilibrium models that came, in the early 80s, following the kind of paradigm shift that we had in the wake of the Lucas critique and moving away from large econometric models as part of the rational expectations revolution. Kidlin and Prescott being a seminal paper there in 1982, and the role of looking at technology and productivity shocks. The course will focus more on, a streamlined version of these RBC models and looking at the key kind of optimization problems that form the key behavioral properties. It's also really, we see it as a key building block of any general equilibrium model, and really a good kind of format to look at as a teaching tool for coding these things in Dynair and Julia. And that'll be an opportunity for us to kind of get our kind of feet dipping in the waters of, at least in a small model context. I think that there are clear limitations to the RBC framework, and we'll talk about that in the course. Things like the limited use for policy, limited role for policy in these models, kind of a restricted view of understanding business cycles in the context of flexible prices and perfect competition. But that'll set the stage for the next set of models that we look at. where we shift over to the, from a new classical to a new Keynesian type of framework, looking at the basic DSGE model, where we introduce market imperfections, key rigidities, both nominal and real, into the model, to understand maybe a better role for monetary policy, welfare implications around business cycle management type of policies, understanding persistence and propagation mechanisms, and so on. I think one of the advantages of the DSGE framework is the kind of modular structure allows for lots of extensions in many different directions, and we'll talk about some of that through the through the days of the course. But there are also limitations, in this framework as well. You see some here. I'll come back to that maybe, but before I talk about that, why don't we look at the next slide? One of the extensions that I mentioned with this kind of flexible framework is looking at it in a small open economy context, and we'll look at that more closely on the third day. This type of new open economy macro approach really took off in a lot of central banks in terms of their modeling frameworks, and also the fund. Examples would be the Sigma model led by Chris Ursig, and the global economy model that Doug Paulo Pacenti worked on at the IMF. Really, as a fairly flexible framework for introducing lots of interesting features for understanding external adjustment, things like price stickiness in different currencies, local currency and producer currency pricing, role of local distribution costs that can give rise to features like pricing to market, understanding things like deviations from the law of one price and incomplete pass-through. So really kind of a fairly flexible framework that that's really found its way into a lot of policy circles in terms of work that we've done at the fund, at the Fed, and other central banks. But of course, the limitations would be also something, again, that we want to talk about. The role of limited stock flow dynamics with this kind of representative agent model approach, not really having sort of really meaningful fiscal policy effects, kind of too much of not really allowing for the possibility of non-Ricardian, non-neutralities in the model, and also kind of some of the other side of the implications of the expectations assumptions on having some jumpiness in the model features. So with each class of model, you have kind of the good and the bad. Whether it's a rich structure, understanding the supply side in the case of the RBC framework, more on the market imperfections and the demand side from the DSGE models and the role for policies, but again, also limitations across the different frameworks. So we'll kind of end up the course looking at moving away from the representative agent framework, infinite horizon planning, to an overlapping generations framework, and really kind of bringing in the implications of heterogeneity in agents. And that will, as you'll see, that will have kind of very fundamental implications for the behavior of the model. It'll give a richness in terms of life cycle features of the model, in terms of consumption and savings behavior. It'll allow for well-defined steady states, being able to talk about some of the long-run policy issues, including the implications for fiscal policy that are sometimes more limited in some of the other frameworks. That's something that, I think that Larry talked about it a little bit in his remarks. As we move from, say, one kind of equilibrium interest rate environment to another, for example, moving to a high debt, public indebtedness context, these kinds of frameworks can be very important for us to look at some of those core issues. And so, the last day of the course, we'll look at some of the extensions, in that OLG framework, some of the things that have made their way into some of the key models that the IMF has made use of, multimod and FSGM, which we use to look at G20 issues, as well as our global integrated monetary and fiscal model, GIMF, that had a lot of this various structures. And so part of what the course really wants to do is kind of look at what the key advantages and disadvantages, even in this case. I mean, the OLG isn't a magic bullet. It has its own drawbacks as well, and some of the things that we'll cover in the course itself. But the idea again is to really help the students not only learn the models but learn how to use the models. What areas of relative strengths where these models can be particularly useful in terms of structuring our thinking, providing us with a good framework, a disciplined framework for economic storytelling, narratives, and really helping the underpinnings of policy. Last slide, please. And maybe just the last thing that I'll say, about the course itself, and really coming back to where I began with this dynamic learning environment and the use of the open source Dynair Julia code, is that one of the things I hope to get out of this course, is to learn as much from the students as they perhaps learn from me, but also this idea of setting up a collaborative platform where, in this kind of open, collaborative approach to learning, we can think about exploring new directions for model development, and where we can go next in terms of our approaches to building these tools in a way that best supports rigorous policymaking. Let me leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hamid. Great presentation. I think we're all really excited for the course. And again, as a reminder, if you're interested in participating in the courses, the links to apply for the courses are on the betterpolicyproject.org website. So I think it's truly great content, and I think really in line with the way that we think about models and their usefulness and their applications. So thanks so much, Hamid. Really appreciate the insights. Next, I'm going to pass it on to Bob Ford for his remarks. It's always our distinct delight to hear from Bob and his perspective. So, Bob, take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you very much first for inviting me to this closing session. My assigned topic is much, how should I say, broader or less specific than the two previous speakers. So in that vein, I'm going to talk at a very high level, and not necessarily to do with Armenia as such. Probably most of what I'm going to say is maybe more relevant for North America and Europe and places like that. But that being more where my expertise lies. I'll put my cards on the table up front for those who don't know. I'm a big fan of inflation targeting, and I'm a big fan of central bank transparency and better communication, both of which are key or core concept of FPAS-2. So I'm fully aligned in that respect. What are the major challenges for the coming years in monetary policy? I think what I'm going to say is not going to be surprising to anybody at this conference. I hope not, anyway. It's for the foreseeable future, and what I mean by the foreseeable future is maybe 12 months. Beyond that, the future is not foreseeable. Is first, of course, getting inflation under control. It's going to be tricky because I don't know. Somehow, I don't know whether this is a fair thing to say. It seems to me that in recent years, maybe because of the great financial crisis and its aftermath, the politics of policy has shifted more towards lowering unemployment and raising output than containing inflation, which has made inflation targeting maybe a little bit more difficult going forward. Central bankers maybe have to be more sensitive to causing unemployment to get inflation to come down, for example, and that's going to be a challenge. It's a communications challenge to some extent, and so I agree fully with Larry that enhanced communications are going to be very important. Explaining what central banks are going to be doing going forward over the next 12 months, which is probably in some countries inducing at least a small recession to get inflation under control, I think. And they're going to take some heat for that. I think central banks, partly because of the fallout from the great financial crisis, and partly because they bungled the past couple of years, allowing inflation to get a little bit out of hand. They have a little bit of a credibility problem that has to be restored. I don't have strong views on how best they should do that. Again, communication is important, but communication isn't everything. You can't rely too much on communication. You've got to talk the talk, but you've got to walk the walk too. I mean, policies have to be put in place. More specifically on FPAS and what's going on at the Bank of Armenia, this new framework for monetary policy, which I think is a terrific initiative. The only really sort of big comment I would say about it, well, maybe two. One is that monetary policy is it's not mechanical. It's inevitably judgmental. You're working under a lot of uncertainty. Again, a theme of FPAS 2, the importance of uncertainty. So every 6 weeks or every quarter, judgment has to be used by basically the leadership of the central bank on what to do. And the other one, and the other thing is times change. So you need to be, in terms of the whole mechanism, needs to be in some sense dynamic over time. And I think FPAS is set up well for this in a way. One of the I think most innovative aspects of this new framework is this very intensive training program that's been put in place, where there's rapid feedback and very specific learning objectives and all that kind of stuff on a very very intensive, very continuous basis. And part of that is just bringing everybody up to speed, but part of that, I think, should become investigating new issues, new problems, new tools, all of that kind of stuff in that framework. Worrying about how the world has changed over a year, things like that, and how monetary policy should best, the framework itself should best respond to all of that. And that's about it for me. That's all I had. My best advice.
Thanks, Bob. See, everyone in the audience, I think you all understood why I said it's always a pleasure to hear from Bob. I think also it would have taken the rest of us probably 45 minutes to have said the same thing. So thanks for your comments as always. It's now my distinct pleasure to introduce our closing of the closing, which will be the keynote remarks by the Governor of the Central Bank of Armenia, Governor Martin Galstyan. Thank you.
Thank you, Vahe. Esteemed colleagues and guests, I would like to thank you for your active participation in the quarterly Central Bank Macro Modeling Workshop. I think it's safe to say that this was a very successful conference where we had the chance to hear from leading researchers and practitioners of some of the most pressing policy-relevant research questions of the day. In particular, I would like to thank our presenters, Michael Keeley, Martin Harding, Jose Elias Gallejos, Alejandro van der Hote, and Sebastian Schmidt for their contributions. Equally as important, the workshop has given us an opportunity to reflect on the policymaking frameworks that we have been developing at the Central Bank of Armenia. That framework, of course, is FPAS Mark II, an idea that we developed with international thought leaders in response to the increasing uncertainty and multi-layered conflicts that have characterized the world since the COVID crisis. I'd like to thank a few of senior advisors who have been supporting us in these efforts: Larry Schembri, David Archer, Hamid Faruqee, Bob Ford, of course, Michel Julliard, Junior Mai, and many others. My colleagues have spoken extensively during the panel discussion about the details and characteristics of FPAS Mark II, but as I reflect on the workshop and the work that remains to be done as we develop and implement this new policy-making framework, I want to focus my thoughts on three very specific questions. First, why are we developing this new FPAS Mark II framework? Beginning in 2020, we were faced with a complex layering of crises. We had a COVID crisis, followed by the war, then further geopolitical conflicts in the broader region. I say this with humility, but the Central Bank of Armenia did a remarkable job in responding to these conflicts and managing the unprecedented level of risks and uncertainty that we were facing at the time. At the same time, this crisis clearly highlighted the limitations of our existing policymaking framework in dealing with this type of situations. The idea of FPAS Mark II was thus born. To think of monetary policy making in a slightly different or perhaps more honest way as an exercise in risk management, where our job during times of uncertainty is to develop policies of least regret and help us avoid dark corners when dangers lurk. As a socially responsible public institution, this is our duty to our constituents to achieve our legal mandate for the price stability and financial stability, irrespective of the challenges and uncertainties that we face. It is my firm conviction that the risk management framework under FPAS Mark II gives us better tools and frameworks to help us achieve this objective. Second, how are we doing this? As we develop a best-in-class policy-making framework from ground up, we're given an incredible opportunity to rethink a number of fundamental questions about how monetary policy departments and the central bank in general should operate. Of course, we are heavily focused on policy-making frameworks and the analytical tools we are using and the research that our team is producing. But at the same time, we're also fundamentally revisiting important ideas about the role of human capital and strongly prioritizing the training and development of our team members. It is our firm belief that high level of professional development and good work-life balance can be achieved. Further, because we're taking a holistic approach to this reform, this provides us with opportunities to improve communication and cooperation across departments and divisions within the central bank and break down unnecessary barriers. FPAS Mark II development team is closely engaged with the Human Resource Department, Statistics Department, Financial Stability, IT and IT security, cybersecurity, and many other departments to resolve many of the challenges associated with developing this new framework. It comes as no surprise to me, but it is a great pleasure to see the incredible high level of collaboration and mutual support between these departments, and the ease and speed with which they are able to reach solutions that benefit everyone at the central bank in general. This brings me to my final question. How does FPAS Mark II fit into the broader vision and strategy of the Central Bank of Armenia? In 2021, we presented our updated strategic plan for the Central Bank of Armenia, where we emphasized our vision, and I quote, to be a leading central bank based on cutting-edge research and innovative solutions. We intended this strategy to be a living vision, a call to action to each and every member at the Central Bank of Armenia to do their part, day in and day out, to contribute to developing a truly best-in-class central bank. I'm humbled to say that this is exactly what has happened. Our team across every department, every division, is leading serious efforts to rethink the way that we do our work, enhance our productivity, improve quality of life, and ultimately better serve the people of Republic of Armenia. This morning, I had the pleasure to introduce our staff to our transformation agenda, which brings together our strategic reform initiatives under a unified umbrella. This agenda is designed to give us the tools to help us better deal with our many strategic challenges as a central bank. Based on the reactions from the several hundred staff members who were in attendance, and based on what I see every day, it is safe to say that every team member has eagerly taken up this call to action. Virtually everyone has committed to taking on the initiative to help us become more effective, more transparent, more credible, and more accountable central bank. As governor, it is my privilege to lead this kind of team, and I look forward to seeing what we will all achieve together in coming months and years. I'd like to conclude my remarks by looking ahead of our next conference in July, which will be our flagship annual workshop. The workshop will take place in July 12 to 14 at the Dilijan Training and Research Center. While we like to keep the quarterly conference small in scale, the annual workshop will give us a chance to feature a much larger number of speakers and researchers. Finally, our team from the CBA will be providing important updates on the state of FPAS Mark II framework, the research they have been leading, and what types of solutions they are finding to human capital, training, and our challenges. I'm confident that this will be our best workshop yet, and I invite you all to register for the workshop and to submit your research if you are interested in presenting. Thank you all for your active participation and contributions to this workshop. I think I speak for all of us when I say that it was a resounding success, and I look forward to seeing you all here in Dilijan in July. Thank you very much.